We're now into module 6. I hope you found the sessions yesterday interesting. You can see we're definitely now narrowing down much more into the how and exploring, what some of the solutions are. And hopefully through the conversations yesterday, you can see some great examples of how people are taking action and aligning the kind of the commercial resilience with also delivering social and environmental value. And the focus of today in module 6 is about looking to the future and exploring ways in which you can support your clients on a low carbon transition. And we've got a lineup of great speakers again this morning. One of whom I mentioned is, I think, still trying to join on. That's Sue Garrard. She was going to go first, but she might come after Ben unless she joins in the next minute or two. But Sue is a CISL fellow and a former executive vice president for sustainable business at Unilever. She has worked in many senior positions in the past. She joined Unilever to take over communications for 180 of their global markets, so a very significant senior role, and then moved on to lead their Sustainable Living Plan initiative in 2014. And so there's a huge amount of experience in the space at the kind of cutting edge of a very competitive commercial environment. She's going to share experience about what does corporate leadership look like in the midst of a pandemic, and also what might it need to look like going forward, given the challenges we've been speaking about in some of the earlier sessions. We then will hear from Ben, and Ben is the Director of Business Strategy at CISL. And before joining CISL, he worked at Forum Future for over 10 years, where he worked very closely with the likes of Sue at Unilever, but also the Co-op, Ecova, O2, and many other organizations beside, really trying to explore ways of aligning kind of their commercial strategies with sustainability. And he will be introducing some of CISL's thinking around how do leading organizations within the real economy really drive and embed change. And this framework, really do pay attention, because this is the framework that you'll be using in your personal assignments next week to help you think through how you might support some of your clients, assuming you are in a client-facing role. For those of you who are in non-client-facing roles, we've got a slightly different activity. All of that is on the online campus. And so you'll be able to refer to some of Ben's slides and material today to support you in that activity next week. So do pay attention, please. And then to bring that framework to life, we're really lucky to have Ian Ellison. He's an associate director at CSL and the former chief engineer of sustainability at Jaguar Land Rover. Ian heads up our 8-week online course on sustainable supply chains. And he's been involved in this program right from the very beginning with the commercial bank, and helps lead these sessions with me for the last 2 or 3 years. So Ian, really good to have you back. And he'll be bringing the framework, CISL's framework, alive through actually walking you through the Jaguar Land Rover case study and some of his experiences while working there. And very briefly about to kind of frame where we are in the session. I've really touched on this yesterday, so I'm not going to labor the point, but we now really are at the end of this funnel, at this kind of last stage around exploring the how. How can we support clients in their low carbon transitions? We hopefully give you some useful tools and frameworks today and ways to think about it in more practical terms. And then you can further try really embed some of that knowledge by working through the self-paced activity next week, all of which, as I mentioned, is on the online campus. And then beyond that, and beyond next week, in week 8, we'll offer a reflection point, and we can come back and hopefully you'll feel then comfortable going out and really engaging your clients in different ways and on the topic of sustainability. So I've already touched on what the agenda is today. I'm not going to say more about that, other than we'll have the 3 presentations up front. We've got a couple of Mentimeter questions in there. I'll put the Mentimeter code up now in the chat function. And again, please do ask questions via the chat function. Some of the speakers might be able to pick up on those while the other speakers are presenting, but otherwise we can come back to those at the end as part of the Q&A session, and before I do kind of final wrap up and close at the end. So I hope that all makes sense. If not, chat function's your place to put any queries in. Sue, I saw your name come up on the list, so glad you could join us. If you could take yourself off mute, I'd like to hand over to you to provide us a view of what corporate leadership looks like now, but also into the future.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Sorry to be doing this through this weird technology, but actually it's amazing what you can do. this is very consistent with what I've been saying to your colleagues who've been on previous versions of this several times. And of course, the big question with all of this that no doubt you've been looking at is, well, has COVID made it harder or easier for this to kind of be on the agenda? And what was telling was that when Thomas and I looked at the slides, what we realized was that what I had been saying for all of last year was even more relevant now. So that's kind of just the only bit of framing I'd do. So I'll try and go through these at pace and leave a bit of time for questions. So the point really is that the climate crisis dwarfs the COVID crisis. And you've heard lots of people, not least of all David Attenborough, saying that. And I just want you to recognise that the operating conditions for your clients are going to change faster than some cases than it's possible to imagine, because when change happens and you reach a tipping point, it tends to happen very quickly. And people who are not on the front foot managing this proactively will end up with serious business problems, and lots of businesses will fail as a result of this. So from your point of view, thinking about your commercial client relationships and your commitments about lowering carbon and wanting a thriving business, there's nothing more important than this on your shopping list alongside COVID recovery. So I'm going to talk through 4 dimensions of how this is going to play out. And if we move on to the first one, you'll see that what we're looking at here is growing pressure from the scientific community into the policy making committees all around the world, of course being reacted to in different ways and at different paces by governments, but recognizing that the window of time to act is shrinking very rapidly. And that for a long time was a piece of policy somewhere out there. Now it's very real, because we're seeing the accelerated impacts on human life, on animal life, on our way of living from this climate emergency. So there is an external pressure that is already starting to drive more and more policy pressures and ideas that will cost your companies, your client companies, money and limit their freedom to operate. So a very tangible input in itself. But if we move on to the second one, the result of that, and I've alluded to it already, is that this is going to strike at the heart of how businesses operate. This is not another tangential small piece of regulatory impact they've got to absorb and a bit of red tape. Obviously, if your clients are in the fossil fuel business, they're in terminal decline. We've already had the CEO of the new CEO of BP saying that he thinks we've already achieved peak oil. But for the mainstream of companies, for whom using fossil fuels is just how they do business, and we're thinking about how they source materials, this is starting to have seismic effects. So if you're a food business and you haven't figured out what the implications are of climate change on land use, yield of crops, affordability of it, pollution regulation, I could go on forever, then that business is probably going to fail. So we are going to see lots of companies who are really good at defining the problem, but just don't have decisive leadership and move fast enough. So be clear what you think the characteristics of those are. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Okay. The third one is that alongside this, and we've seen exactly this impact with COVID. So COVID has actually exacerbated and brought more sharply into relief all these issues. You see the gap between the haves and the have-nots, and the view that actually COVID is not equal in its impact by a very long way will be replicated, as indeed already being replicated by the climate crisis and other eco issues. And what we're finding more and more is that sense of social inequality is putting capitalism in the dock. And whether that shows up as riots, whether that shows up as profound questions about what the role of the company is, which there's a very growing noise around. You have governments in various parts of the world really seriously questioning whether the single-minded pursuit of profit is the right thing. And you look at what Macron has done in France, where he's allowed a listed company to become a social enterprise, with Danone being the first to say, we're going to do that, and shareholders voting for that. Just think about that for a minute, what a shift that represents. This is just the start in a decade of unrivaled disruption, of people understanding the link between environmental and social, them recognising that the licence to operate of businesses as a pure profit-making short-term delivery machine is becoming increasingly compromised, and that looking at the social impacts of business and understanding that holistically is going to be critical. Companies that don't do that again will face shareholders, never mind customers, pulling away because it will make them vulnerable. And then the final macro trend really that I would pull out is a bit of good news to cheer you up, because we all need a bit of that at the moment. And what we know is that faced with these deep concerns, consumers, I really mean citizens, in our act of buying things, have made a big shift. 5 years ago, people would say, it's all very serious, but it's way above my head. Somebody will sort it out. It didn't feel immediate enough, and there wasn't quite enough urgency to act. That's all changed. That means that consumers want to play their part in being a responsible customer, and they want to do that by buying brands and working with businesses they think are responsible. So if you can decode that and deliver it and it's authentic, this is a growth opportunity. So it's a falsehood to believe that, at least at this phase of development, that the corporate reaction to this global emergency automatically requires you to contract the size of your business. Some businesses will go by the board, some will grow very quickly, those that get it right and are part of the future. And that's what markets do. And what you need to do is decode how the markets are going to behave and who the winners and losers are going to be over the next 10 years. So what I've given you is just a very simple framework to try and help do that diagnosis. Okay. So there it is in summary. If we just move on one. So that's great. So how do you know what a good company looks like? What are the kind of the symptoms and behaviors and characteristics of your client companies in terms of how you think about which are the ones that I think are likely to do well and which are the ones that I would call a problem children or quite potentially not going to exist for much longer? So what I've given you here is the perfect company. And by the way, there's almost no company I know of, and I think CISL colleagues would agree, that tick all these boxes. But what you're looking for is quite a lot of these characteristics being developed in the company. Then you've got a good shorthand for sensing, is this company looking at its future in the context of these threats, challenges and opportunities in the right way? Are they going to be fit for the future, or are they a risk? Okay. So it starts with the little dot at the bottom. The most fundamental mistake that most companies make is they have two competing plans. They have a business plan and they have a sustainability plan. What do they remunerate people on? The business plan. What do they talk about all the time? The business plan. What is it that the CEO asks about when he goes on his visit? The business plan, or in days when he could do visits, etc. You see my point. If you're paid to deliver the business plan, no matter how much you like the sustainability plan, unless the leadership team can bring the two together and help you understand how the sustainability plan contributes to and strengthens the business plan, you're forced as an individual in a company to make a choice about which you support. And guess what? You support the business plan because that's what you're paid to do. So one of the most fundamental elements of this is that the CEO and the leadership team can clearly and concretely articulate why their sustainability plan is good and necessary for the business. If they do nothing else but they can do that, that is an essential first step. And if any of the leaders of the companies that you back can't do that, that's the place to start, because you won't make progress and their sustainability plans won't literally be sustainable. That has to be led by a very committed leadership, hence the next point. Increasingly, though, we live in a world where doing less harm is not good enough. And so increasingly what we're seeing is that companies are looking at the most material issues. You can't do this across everything, but the one or two things that are really your issue, like packaging for a packaged goods company, it's not brain surgery, actually say, we need to be more than doing less harm, we need to be doing good. And the techie language for that is net positive. If it's an environmental target, you want that to take the IPCC's data about halving, at least this aggressive, and you need them to say, this is the full carbon footprint of our organisation, and we're going to do what science requires us to do, which is to halve our carbon emissions over the next 10 years. So that's a quick guided tour to the science-based targets. Those are critical. Otherwise, your company is really, that whichever company it is not holding themselves to the right standard. All of that means that they need to be capable of doing what Kodak couldn't, which is not just telling you in theory how the market was going to change. They need to be capable of sustaining their current business model whilst innovating something often radically different. The third point, very simply, is that it's no good to set targets if they're just about your scope of operations. So if I take two very different businesses, most packaged goods businesses have almost all of their impacts on things like energy and water, the big greenhouse gas drivers, downstream in consumer use. So the question there is, if you're using one of those soap powders or shampoos, what can you as the manufacturer do to reduce the carbon footprint of consumers using your product? And if I take another sector, fashion, almost all of the carbon emissions are upstream in the way that the cotton is ginned, the fabric is dyed, and so on and so forth. So again, if you're an H&M or a Primark, then you're looking really at only 3% of all the carbon emissions associated with your business being in your direct control. So it's a cop-out, frankly, in terms of solving the problem that needs to be solved if you don't have a target that goes across the full value chain. And that means you need to understand the full system that you work in. And then finally, very briefly, that leads you to a different way of working. Because it's a system that you're trying to change, not just your own operation, you need to collaborate in a way that businesses historically haven't. You need to create critical mass in markets to drive faster change. So if you're someone investing in recycling technology for a particular type of plastic, you want to know that Coca-Cola, Nestle, Unilever, all the big guys are all going to be producing a certain kind of plastic that can be fed into your machine, so your infrastructure capital cost is actually justified by a regular feed of plastic stock into it. Otherwise, that business model doesn't work. So increasingly, you need to be seeing groups of industry working in a pre-competitive space to start to drive bigger system change much, much faster than is happening at the moment. I'm going to leave it there because I've chucked an enormous amount at you. So the final two slides quickly. How do you start to apply this? Because you're all sitting there thinking, how does this work in my day job, right? So how it works in your day job, here's a very simple suggestion. What we've got here is a classic Boston matrix up the side, thinking about identifying where your clients sit on this maturity curve. Vertically, we're looking at potential for you actually generating income out of those clients. And along the bottom on the horizontal axis, we're looking at how you can actually build a deeper relationship with those customers. And of course, the two ultimately will go hand in hand. So this is just a really simple three-staged approach to how you engage your customers to identify where they are on their own journey, where you should be pushing them to, and what that means in terms of your own corporate opportunity, risk and exposure, and growth. So the first, very simply, is, do you actually know what your client's current sustainability strategy and ambitions are? And that's a useful conversation to have with every single one of your clients regularly, because that's going to be part of your due diligence anyway, if you look at the way that regulation is going very quickly. That then moves you on, however, to analysing and you having a point of view about how good you think that strategy is. Is it fit for purpose? So this is classic TCFD territory without the label on, but understanding, does that client understand what its risk exposure is? Is there an opportunity for them? Can they engage their consumer or customer base and use something as a differentiating point of growth if they get ahead of their market on some element of sustainability? And that then takes you to the third and final point, which is understanding where the future lies and how that coincides with your client's business, and whether there are growth opportunities there or whether the risk mitigation is something that requires funding and managing. So it's a very simple model, but it starts to immediately give you something where I would encourage you to mentally plot all your key clients on there. If you can't plot them, that tells you something, and it tells you need to start the engagement at the bottom. But ultimately, your objective is to get to the top there so that you can really understand what this means for each individual client. But you can also map it on to your big target announced by Alison on the 14th of February about halving the carbon emissions of your lending book. So there's a question to wrap up on here, which speaks for itself, so I won't read it out. But I would encourage you in the few minutes we've got left to fire any questions at me on the chat function, and I'll do what I can very pithily to try and respond to them.
Great, thank you, Sue. That was very bang on time, to the point, and really helpful. And we've got the Mentimeter cloud that's come up here, or the Mentimeter questions. So if you can start adding some of your responses there. And if there are questions, if somebody wants to come off mute and ask Sue a question directly, I see that none have come up in the chat function. Maybe that's because you were spellbound by what Sue was saying. But if there's a particular question you'd like to ask while we wait for the responses to come through, then feel free. Now's your time.
I'm first on, aren't I? So you've got to kind of get going, but you've got me for 3 minutes in terms of the ability to direct a Q&A at me.
We'll have some more time for Q&A at the end, and also to say that maturity curve, we slotted that in to remind you again that next week when you're doing a self-paced assignment, to think through, to use that kind of curve to help you think through some activity.
This is interesting what's coming up here, though, isn't it? Because what you're all saying instinctively is that actually you think either you or you and the client in your relationship are both at the bottom of that curve, which is absolutely fine and not wildly different from what I would expect. It does also mean, therefore, that the bank is exposed to quite a lot of risk that at the moment so you're in a case of unconscious incompetence, to use that slightly challenging phrase. And I would suggest that what you want to do as an immediate priority is get that fact finding done and step back and say, both at a single client level, but also at a wider picture level, both what risks does that mean you're exposed to? What's best practice look like in any particular sector? How can you help clients to go on that journey with you? And how do you do that in a way that mitigates your risk, but also looks at where there are untapped growth opportunities? And in some sectors and for particular types of businesses, they're very significant. That's it for me. 1 minute early, Thomas.
Yeah, perfect. Because I think I even overrun by a couple of minutes because we started a couple of minutes late. So we're all good for time. And Teresa raised a good point there in the chat function as well, that I know some of you are also not necessarily directly client facing in your direct roles, but clearly you're going to be supporting colleagues to deliver this and to kind of cascade down whatever might be risk decisions or whatever. And as part of your assignment next week, we've got a slightly different activity if you're not a client facing space, thinking using a stop-start, continue framework, thinking, and to try to develop some actions. What might you stop, start, or continue that could help support your colleagues do the fact finding, get to the analysis phase, and then continue on the journey. So Sue, thank you very much. I know you're able to hang around to the end. I'm going to
stick around for the Q&A. I hope you're going to be more lively in an hour or so.
And feel free to ask questions via the chat function. And if they're simple and straightforward to answer, Sue can do that now via chat. Otherwise, we can have more lengthy conversations at the end.
Yeah.
And so, Ben, over to you now. To provide a bit of a framework, we've got Rewiring the Economy, which is CISL's kind of overarching framework for how finance, government, and businesses can work collaboratively to drive systemic change. And I think you're going to focus on how businesses in the real economy can drive change, and giving some kind of key indicators that could help support people on the program as they think through the activities and kind of engaging clients going forward. So over to you.
Thanks, and really great to join you all. So building on what Sue said there, I want to really help you navigate what to look out for when you're looking or working with a client in that analysis phase or the fact-finding phase. What does good look like, and how do you can tell if it's sort of embedded in the business? So to kick off, I want to start by actually looking at where's some best practice today. So I think first of all, Mars, they launched their Sustainable in a Generation plan. And I think what's interesting here is that they really worked closely with a number of experts, not least the Stockholm Resilience Centre, which you can see in that sort of dial, did a famous piece of work looking at environmental limits to really understand and engage with experts to understand what the impact of their business was right across the value chain, as Sue was saying, right the way from sort of growers through to consumer use and so on. And that then really led to their goal, one of which, interestingly, was that they wouldn't have a net increase in use of agricultural land, recognising that we have global pressures on environmental land. So that's kind of, I think, one thing I wanted to pull out about Mars. Another interesting business is Olam, which is actually a 20 billion euro business you may not have heard of, based in Singapore. It's a huge agricultural and food business that tends to supply to brand manufacturers. They've also, I think, really interesting because they've really aligned their vision, purpose and strategy. So as you can see here, their vision is to be the most differentiated and valuable global food and agri business by 2040. But also what they've done is they've said they want to become a regenerative business. So when Sue was talking about net positive, that's essentially net positive for an agricultural business. So and they talked about 3 outcomes: creating prosperous farmers and food systems, secondly, thriving communities, secondly, and thirdly, regeneration of the living world. So they really understood, going back to Sue's point, what are they reliant upon in terms of society, so the communities around their businesses, also that they need, a healthy farmers and food systems in order to have soil health and people working in their fields and so on. They recognize that and so on. And so they've built goals and outcomes around that. So they've really understood what their business is reliant upon. And that in turn is underpinned by 10 priority areas. So they both align their purpose and strategy and really sort of embedded it in the business and understood what those material areas are. And so what we see then is that, as you've sort of heard from people like Tony, is that in this diagram, this sort of cartoon we've got, you probably can't see it, but it says, be sure to wash your hands and all will be well. So while we're caught up understandably with COVID, what I think that's shown is that how interconnected and actually vulnerable our current global economy is, and also the inequalities in that. And so as Alan Jope, Unilever's CEO, said, the other big problems in the world, things like climate change and inequality, are not going away. So I think it's really key when looking at your clients, see, are they really connecting the dots and understanding what they're reliant upon in terms of nature and society, in terms of how they're creating social, financial value. So what we've done is we created, as Thomas mentioned, a Rewiring the Economy report, which sets out 10 actions over 10 years to really deliver a sustainable economy. In other words, delivering on the Sustainable Development Goals. And I want to pull out these sort of 4 actions that we identified for business. And so these are action or tasks, if you like, that are saying, what is it that businesses are doing? And so I'm going to walk through each of these. So first of all, task 7 we talk about is, as we've seen from those examples, is really aligning organizational purpose with strategy and business models. What we talk about is what's often you hear a lot about purpose, of course, this idea of businesses going beyond just profit maximizing. But unless it's really anchored into the idea of this, global trends we're facing, and in other words, the sustainable future, it risks being purpose wash and not really driving long-term value creation. Bring the two together and it has huge potency to add real bite and relevance to purpose. And also purpose is able to really bring alive the contribution, the unique contribution and distinctive contribution that business can make to a sustainable future. So we talk about a sustainable purpose then as being a meaningful and enduring reason for an organization to exist that is profitably contributing to a sustainable economy while protecting and restoring those social and environmental dependencies it relies upon across the value chain, as we've seen there with businesses like Olam. And so that's a really key element. And as Sue mentioned, that does mean either having a sustainability strategy or a commercial one. It's integrating the two together. And that's really about engaging and aligning the board and the executive team along that. So if we move on then to think about this, lies actually is that there's a lot of opportunities. So with initiatives like TCFD, Task Force for Climate Change Disclosure, a lot of the focus is on risks. What's the risks of climate change? What this is not necessarily revealing is the huge opportunities and upsides of businesses that, as Sue mentioned, can really adapt to these radically changing external trends. Because if you are, you're really set fair for long-term value creation, unlocking new markets. And this, I think, provides a really rich lens on. You're starting to see a number of thinkers coming through, looking at new strategy models. So, for example, on the left, you can see here, this is about the kind of red ocean, blue ocean strategy, which came out as INSEAD by Chan Kim and Morborn. And the idea there is that you have either red ocean strategies, which is really trying to essentially grow commodified, exhausted, or declining established markets. Blue ocean strategy is about really where is that uncontested new market space. Similarly, Alex Edmonds from London Business School talks about growing the pie. So again, rather than seeing growth as being a finite amount which either benefits business or society, he's talking about business strategies that are really delivering value for business and society at the same time by innovating its products and services. And there are other schools of thought coming through, but I think that what sustainability does is really help to bring a lens to that understanding of strategy, to really unpack those new markets and unmet needs. A brief example of that is Umicore, which is a Belgian sort of high polluting, unprofitable business. It was back in the late 90s. In 2001, it brought in a new purpose, materials for a better life, and it pivoted its core capabilities around material science, chemistry, and metallurgy into clean tech, recycling, and unlocking new markets. Over 10 years, it had a tenfold increase R&D spend, and now it's a 13.7 billion euro business, which is set fair really as a leader in clean tech and the recycling industry. And so what we're seeing then is that a purpose that's really aligned with sustainability then is both relevant in it's really tackling those global trends that we've been looking at, and is both relevant into the future. It's holistic understanding its negative and positive impacts. It's authentic and it's really enduring, and it can really inform practically decision making. And it's central to really shaping the business model and its strategy. And it's really owned by both a sense of ownership by employees and the board. So moving on then, the other key element I think we see is once you've identified, a business has identified what it's reliant upon, is then really saying, what are the levels of ambition? So if, for example, it's reliant on reducing its carbon impact, or certain key populations like producers for a coffee company, for example, is setting evidence-based goals. And what that does is once you identify what needs to be changing, it then tells you how fast or how steep the transition and the level of innovation needs to be. And as the next sort of slide illustrates, is that we've seen, for example, at World Economic Forum at Davos, the founder there was calling on businesses to be carbon zero by 2050 or before. And we've seen a whole slew of companies from Microsoft, Amazon, Sky, Sainsbury's, Walmart just last week, coming out saying they're going to be net zero before then, or regenerative. And so we're seeing this sort of movement very much in that direction. And that helps set, as Mark Carney talks about, what's the speed of transition a business needs to go through to innovate its business model in order to be aligned with the future. So what that then is required is that really needs to be embedded in the core working practices in the business. No good having a strategy which isn't embedded in the business. So it needs to be, as any other strategy plan, cascaded into business unit and functional plans, into director bonuses and aligned with pay and rewards. And also it needs to understand who the key populations are that need to deliver that, in a similar way that you're being supported in your client-facing roles predominantly. Who are the other key populations within your client business that needs to be supported? Which part of the business might need to change first? For example, new product development, for example. And then it's about really trying to build that culture. So the leaders need to be really setting the tone and showing how they're making key dilemmas or strategic decisions that's really aligned with the purpose and the strategy, and then it's externally focused on what impact it's having and really building those success stories. So if you move on then to think about then also the role of innovation is critical in all of this, and there are different levels. Often businesses start with thinking about what's the incremental change. So how can we reduce carbon by 2 or 3% here? And that's one place to start, but it won't go far enough. We're seeing another level of innovation, which is actually re-engineering the whole value chain and really thinking differently about the whole value chain works, and maybe taking out links in that chain, through to then disruptive new value propositions and creating whole new markets, which I'll be coming on to. And that might express itself as, for example, what's the percentage of R&D spend? And that's a good question to look at. For example, a lot of oil companies will say they've got a single figure percentages looking at renewable energies, which tells you a lot about their R&D strategy. Also, are those businesses integrating those goals into their NPD and innovation processes? Are they using open innovation to bring in other external partners and future customers to co-create those innovations? Is it informing their mergers and acquisition strategy? And is it really fundamentally informing and shaping those new value propositions? And so what that tells us is that actually a lot of businesses, we need to be thinking about both, if you like, the business models of today and tomorrow. So this one technique called the 3 horizons, this blue line, shows, if you like, a lot of business models that are high waste, high carbon, and have a sell-by date written on them. So this shows how they're really likely to die out pretty much, very soon under the sort of trends and pressures you've been facing and looking into. So asking the business, what are those actual new business models and propositions of the future, which might be, say, being incubated or piloted right now, or might be in startups that might be being acquired, and what would be the route to scale for really scaling those up through the business? And that's, if you like, your future third horizon, which are the business models of tomorrow. And then what are those sort of bridging technologies that might bridge you from the current business model into those future ones? As Sue was saying, because businesses need to both optimize the business models today to bring in the profits and investments, and to invest in and scale those business models of tomorrow. So finally, just as what you need to do also is companies need to bring other people with them. They need to advocate to create the right enabling conditions. They also need to work with other players in the sector, be they competitors, or bring supply chains with them in order to enable that strategy. And so what all this does, I think, is this moves on to think about how there's a fundamental shift in the way in which businesses are being understood to create value. As the next slide shows, at the moment, our understanding of value creation is really very narrow, which is essentially what's the financial value creation within the legal boundary of the business that businesses, of course, are reporting on. But the reality is that that value creation is reliant on a whole network of dependencies on society, on the environment as inputs and outputs, but also reliant on things like clean air, a stable climate, clean water, none of which we can any longer take for granted. And so really what we need to do is understand how businesses are reliant on those dependencies, and what are they doing to protect and enhance them, and do they have business models that are profitably able to protect those moving forward? And this takes into the whole realm, of course, of non-financial reporting, which is a fast changing area. So just to kind of sum up then, I think what we're seeing is a fundamental shift really in the way we're thinking about the role of business and how we're thinking about businesses, from the current focus, which is primarily looking at financial value creation and profit maximization in the short term. It's often based on linear, if you like, value chain thinking. It's often about incremental change, assuming that change happens incrementally and will continue to happen incrementally, which is inconsistent with all of the evidence you've seen. It's also quite instrumental and transactional in it, both in terms of with customers, but also as employees. It can feel very instrumental, transactional relationship. Whereas I think the future we're moving into, which are the companies that are already pulling away from the competition and are likely to succeed in the future, are actually saying, how do we actually create multiple forms of value creation? So how are we both delivering benefits to shareholders and society and the environment on which we're reliant upon? It's future orientated. It's looking at the speed with which it needs to transition and adjust to these exponential changes that we're facing into. It's therefore thinking systemically, as Sue was touching on, around their relationship with those different stakeholders and inputs into the business. It's also evidence-based, looking at how fast, not what can they do, what does need to be done in order to track those external changes in society and the environment. And I think the other aspect is it's really helping to bring meaning, identity, and inspiration, not just to employees, but to suppliers, to customers, to investors, rallying around the actual fundamental role that businesses are playing in society. And so the purpose of that business and aligned to its strategy is really driving the core business. It's not a side of plate peripheral activity. It's fundamentally informing and driving the strategy and value propositions. So that's where I'd sum up this fundamental shift I think we're seeing in the way in which we're understanding value creation. So just to bring that to around a question, it'd be great to get your feedback on the Mentimeter. is taking a classic customer or client of yours, maybe just bring one to your mind's eye, which reflects the sort of typical client you're working with. How well do you think they're typically performing across those sort of those 4 areas? If you had to do a quick with what you know about them already, how would you think you're rating across them? It'd be great to share your feedback on the Mentimeter. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ben. That was really helpful overview. And again, we have some of that summarized in your online module for next week. There's a question that's come up, and a few people have liked that. So both for, I guess, directed at Sue, but maybe Ben, you could offer initial view, and while Sue comes off mute as well. But we've had, you've both spoken about this disruption and things changing. And this was Peter Davids asked, well, we touched on COVID, this was Sue, but also oil and gas is clearly on its declining now. What other sectors might be at risk of disruption?
Well, I think every sector's at risk of disruption. In some, it's inevitable that it will happen. In others, it depends on where some lateral innovator comes from. But just to give you a couple of examples, we've now got the building industry building high-rise buildings from wood, because as you probably know, one of the other big sectors that's a problem child in terms of carbon footprint is construction. And for a long time, the industry has gone, no, it'll never happen. And this tends to be what you will see, the common trait, which is a classic change curve, which is denial up to the point where it's almost too late to accept and do anything about the fact that people have innovated around you. So I think the construction industry is ripe for that. And I can tell you, you can probably see I'm sitting in a very old house with some beams. I said I wanted to have a 0 carbon footprint in this house. And I saw 8 consultants over 6 months who all told me it was impossible. And guess what? I then found one guy who said, no problem at all. This is how we do it. You have an air source heat pump, you insulate the walls, you do blah, blah. I won't bore you with the detail. You buy renewable electricity. So I've done all that. And that was because one guy came along in the face of what I would call the traditional building trade and said, yeah, of course it can be done. So the answers are all out there. They're just not evenly distributed at the moment. And it will happen in every single sector. And if you look at the fact that you've got, for example, major companies like P&G and Unilever looking at innovations where they encourage you not to wash your clothes, bearing in mind that they own the biggest clothes washing brands in the world. Why are they doing that? They're doing that because they know we all overwash our clothes, and then they can sell you something which just makes your clothes wearable for longer, that doesn't affect the environment, is easy to put through the post. And if they don't do it, they know lots of other innovators are working on that kind of market displacement already. So you could, if Unilever and P&G weren't doing that, you could see the whole of their market share go within the period of 5 to 10 years in what's one of their staple categories. So I think you'll find it happening absolutely everywhere. And what every client needs to be doing is reviewing how it defines its competitive set very differently, much more widely, and looking at disruptors.
And I think maybe just to add to that, the other thing is that we know quite a lot about the kind of critical sectors that will, so where there's big gaps and where there's ripe for disruption. So building on what Sue said, I think we know that sort of the whole built environment, the role of cities is critical. We know transportation is critical, which is great. We're going to hear from Ian, who's really expert in this area, and so that's another big sector. The whole of the food sector we know is going to be critical as well, and then of course energy. So we know these are going to be absolutely essential, where the big pinch points are. I think the other ones that are really interesting is the enablers of those, particularly the role of tech. So and both not just the tech giants we'd expect as huge enablers of new areas, but also whole area of chemistry. I think the whole chemical industry has been somewhat under the radar, both in terms of their impact, which is similar to aviation and shipping, but they're a huge enabler of, through the technologies that we're going to be seeing coming through. not only to decarbonise but to provide a lot of those solutions. But as Sue said, I think all sectors are going to be disrupted. It's just the extent and in what areas.
Thomas, do you want me to have a quick go at the Danone question?
Let's save that for the end, if that's okay. We can come.
Okay, I just have to remember what it is, because I may not be able to see it by then, but if someone can remember, that's fine.
So what enabled Danone to become a social enterprise? Do you think they are ahead of the curve on ESG? But I realize we haven't yet reflected, Ben. If you want to give we'll see you can do that. And Bianca, if you could bring back the slides, and Ben can just give a moment of reflection on the comments to the Mentimeter. That would also be great, and then we can move on to Ian. So yeah, Sue, just a quick reflection would be great.
Yeah, so Danone have been on a journey to become a B Corp for several years. So yes, they're ahead of the curve is the short answer. Now, B Corp isn't the same as a social enterprise, but it's got a lot of qualities in common. And the way that Danone have tackled this has been very smart, because what they've done is they've tried not to achieve it en bloc as a whole organisation right from the start. They've broken it down both across two dimensions. Firstly, across their main operating divisions. So they have food, they have baby care, and they have water. And then they've also done that in terms of geographies. So they've said, which businesses can we get through the B Corp process so that, and we then learn, and that then becomes a kind of continuous improvement model and extends more widely across the business. So in time, Danone, I'm sure, will be the first European-based major listed company that's a B Corp, but that has enabled them to put in place a business model where shareholders, because bear in mind, shareholders still have a voting right. 97% of Danone's shareholders voted in favour of making it a social enterprise. So the legal framework was created, but the real trick there is for shareholders to understand and believe, and ideally see a track record, that if you operate what's called a multi-stakeholder model, that delivers good long-term sound growth for the shareholder. And that, I think, has been what's been key to their success. Most other companies are a long way behind. This is not ESG. ESG is a compliance mentality. Things like social enterprise and B Corp are much more about a growth and a purpose mentality than a compliance mentality. That's as quick as I can give that answer meaningfully, Thomas.
That sounds perfect. Thanks, Sue. And Ben, just a moment of reflection on what you see in this Mentimeter response. I see only 17 people have responded, and there's 50 of you on the call, so we need more participation. But Ben, just a few reflections of what's come up.
Yeah, so really helpful to see that. I'm quite pleasantly surprised. So I'd say that's above average, quite above average where I'd see probably most businesses if we took the broad bell curve. So great to see that you feel your clients moving that direction. I think the things to look out for, I think, is first of all, that task 7 is, have they really understood what's material across the value chain? That's what a lot of businesses will focus on, their direct impacts. And so I think that's one thing to highlight. Also, the task 8, evidence-based goals, that really ratchets up the ambition. So I'm not surprised that's a lag indicator. That's below the median, because that really separates businesses that have not only understood what's material, but how fast they need to innovate. And then normally there's a lag as they're embedding it into the business through tasks 9 and 10. So I think that looks like a nice, encouraging result, but also I think backs up what we saw in the last one, which is that the risk there is that that's presenting a risk to your clients and your portfolios of not really flushing out where those opportunities are.
Great, thanks, Ben. And so Ian, you've got a slightly different deck with a few transitions, so you'll share your own deck. So Ian is going to provide a case study to bring some of what Ben has been speaking to life. I've been holding off a few questions, Ian, about batteries and benefits of electric versus the general questions we always have, and it's always a kind of it depends type question. But there have been a few around battery technologies, whether electric beats fossil fueled powered cars, etc. So I'm sure you'll weave some of that in, but we can also otherwise come back to some of those questions that people have had in previous weeks after the session. So Ian, over to you.
Indeed. Okay. Can you see my slides there, Thomas?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, so Ian, listen, I worked for Jaguar Land Rover from 2011 to 2018. I worked in the product development area. We also had a corporate sustainability team whose job it was to face off to the outside world, investors, the press, public, and so forth, and to do reporting. My team and I were very much involved in the actual product, the manufacturing of it, its materials and so on. I deliberately joined that part of the team because I felt that was the thing that was going to make a difference to our overall impacts. So in this presentation, what I've tried to do is refer back to the 4 tasks that were introduced by Ben there and sort of map what we did in our journey against each of those tasks. And my mission from 2011 onwards was to try and create a sustainable business out of Jaguar Land Rover, knowing that their main business was selling 3-ton SUVs. And I was kind of emotionally invested in this. I worked for them from the age of 18 to the age of about 25 as well. They kind of trained me through university and in my early graduate years. And I then left, did a whole variety of other things, and came back because I saw existential risk. I saw a company I loved really being at danger to not exist in the future. And I thought that I'd like to try and do something about that. So the first thing, and going back to the tasks there, is to set evidence-based targets to measure and be transparent. So the first thing I set up my team to do was to do life cycle assessment, to say, for each of the products we make, what materials are in there, what energy is used, what are the processes that are used, and at the end, what are the emissions and the waste that are left behind. So we created a conceptual model of that, and being a techie engineering team, we then put that into a computer model, which was many layers deep. We're talking about cars that have 20 or 30,000 processes to create them, 3,000 or 4,000 parts go into them. You've got a supply chain which is 7 layers deep in many cases. So really complicated computer models, some really specialized stuff here to say, to try and capture what it is that we do in terms of materials and processes and their impacts. Then a bit more digestible, out of that would come a report. And we produced a report for each of the new models we introduced. We had it certified by the vertical certification agency, who sign off that a car is legal to sell. The life cycle assessment was not a legal requirement, but we treated it as if it was, so that we made sure we got our maths right and the thing was credible. That was a bit more readable. That will tell you the resources we used, our impact on climate, our energy consumption, water, our impact on biodiversity and ecosystems, air quality, and so on. And we were really excited by all of this because it's one of the biggest projects in this space at that particular time. A car is the most complicated mass-produced item that I can think of. And it was a very complicated supply chain, and it impressed other people. We won the Responsible Business of the Year award in 2013-14 on the back of this kind of in-depth activity. What we neglected when in our excitement was that actually outside of our little bubble, no one was really listening to us, because we were talking about eutrophication, photochemical ozone creation potential, 100-year global warming potential, all this techie language that is a little bit opaque to most people. And so we felt we needed another step, because we wanted to make change with this, not just create technical models. So the step we took was to translate everything that we'd learned technically into a more easy language. So first of all, plain English. So we're talking about livelihoods, health, education impacts, waste, land use, and so on. So we stripped of its technical language. And we gave it a unit of measure rather than these scientific biophysical units of measure that few can understand. We said, let's just turn everything into money. Let's find out, we're making profit, that's already in money. We're paying taxes, that's already in money. But we're making CO2. What does it cost to get rid of the CO2 we've made? What are the costs of creating pollution to the air and so on? So we translated all of these things into money. We worked with PwC, who have some very capable environmental economists who have kind of parameters around this. They don't pay me to advertise them, so there are other reassuringly expensive consultants and economists in this space that can help you with this. But we translated everything we were doing into these categories and into a monetary impact. And we did that for 2015, which is the year we were just going into, and for 2020 for everything we were going to produce. So 600,000 vehicles, every combination, every market, and calculated social, environmental and economic and fiscal impacts of each of those and put a number to that. So we really understood it, and we had something which was a common, easy currency for people to understand and engage with. So When we then stepped back from that and said, well, what does that mean? We came across this kind of model here, which is to looking backwards for sort of 10 years and forwards for 10 years. When we looked at all the different categories, and at the same time we were doing this in 2015, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals were coming out. So 17 goals that are kind of blueprint for a successful global society. And when we looked at how our metrics mapped with these, and they mapped quite well, we saw about half of these things required exponential growth. So there's going to be growth in population. With that, we have to have growth in food output. We have to have growth in jobs and earnings and so forth. However, the other half of the metrics behind that sort of construct of the Sustainable Development Goals need to go the other way. Carbon emissions, as we all know now, need to peak rather suddenly and soon and go down very sharply. The same is true of air quality. The same is true of the damage we're doing to the seas and to waterways. The same is true of biodiversity and so on. So you've got two sets of metrics which measure a system which is bound up within itself. And they need to start diverging. One group need to go exponentially upwards, the others need to dive downwards. And we haven't really noticed that until now because we've been dealing with this through efficiency. We've been growing the economy and output and so forth and getting more and more efficient smartly. So the curves haven't diverged very much. But if you look where we need to be at the end of this decade, the curves will diverge a lot. And that's really important. We're not that gap is just going to get worse and worse and worse on top of lots of other crises that we hadn't foreseen in 2015. So there's a really big problem there, and that's the problem I gave to my team to say, right, fill that gap because it's urgent and it's growing rapidly. So my team sat down with the data that we had and said, okay, what do we know here? Well, we know we make cars from stuff, and that stuff needs extracting and refining. It's turned into parts, it's assembled into cars. We then sell those cars, they're fueled and driven and parked and disposed of. So we have a really good understanding of what goes on in there. So let's dig into that and say, well, what do we know about the impacts of that value chain, and what could we change to actually improve those impacts and reconcile those two diverging curves? So if you're talking about something like raw materials, and we made many of our cars out of aluminium. So if you take that one specific value chain, aluminium comes from ore, from rock. You take 4 tons of that out of the ground. Out of that, you get 2 tons of alumina. You then get a ton of sheet pure aluminium. And out of that, you get about 1/2 ton of body, which is about enough to make one car. So you see the enormous amount of waste there is in there. 1/2 ton of metal in a car requires 8 tons, or 8 times as many kilograms of material to be extracted, and 7/8 of that is waste in some way. So there's an enormously wasteful process there, and that applies to very many. As we dig into all these supply chains, there's a huge amount of waste in the supply chains. What can you do about that? Well, there are already 1 billion cars in the world, and they're made of the stuff that you need to make cars. So if you can recover what you need to make your new car out of an old car, then the impact of all of that goes down by more than 90%. So rather than having something which is where 7/8 of the material is waste and has process efficiency and impacts on the environment, if we could create a circular flow of material within the industry, that would be enormously helpful. And so we applied that way of thinking to lots of different elements or to all of the elements of our value chains. So, and we noticed that there was systemic waste just about everywhere we looked. So just in the use part of a car's life, when it's sold to a customer, they believe they bought it to drive it. What they actually do is park it. Mostly 95% of the time they park it, and they just drive it 5% of the time. When they're driving it typically with 5 seats. Typically only one of those seats has a bottom on it. The car's designed to last 10 years and about 100,000 miles, but the same materials can be assembled into a car to last 1 million miles. That's how a London taxi does it. So we don't design the car to extract the maximum life out of it. Legally, we have to design each car so that it can be 85% recycled. So we've designed for a closed loop circular economy model. But when you talk to the people who process the waste, that's very rarely achieved. And much of the mass of a car at the end of its life goes into landfill or is burned. So the system doesn't deliver even what it's capable of. So at this point, I kind of reflect, and I'm talking to bankers there. So when you think about the financial implications of this, you've got $10,000 of car You've got 1 billion of those in the world. So this is a $10 trillion asset. We're only using one of the 5 seats for 5% of the time. So you have 1% utilization of that $10 trillion asset. You know, and if I came to you and asked you to finance that and you weren't already in business, you would say, hang on, that doesn't sound like you're really achieving very much. Could you not squeeze a bit more value out of it? And it sounds a bit crazy. But it's not so crazy. We're all invested in it. I'm invested in it. You're invested in it. That's how we behave, and we accept that as normal. So there's an enormous opportunity to squeeze more value out of this. And that was the thing that really fired my team up to say, you know, and I kept sending them away saying, you've got to bring those divergent curves together. And there's a huge opportunity sat right in front of you here. So one of the other tasks of the 4 tasks that Ben was talking about is to embed sustainability into practices and decisions. So that's what we set out to do. So the first thing is, as I say, a circular economy. So all of the molecules, all of the materials that went into the car shouldn't be going to waste. They should be made into new cars. And there's a billion of them. We kind of got enough materials out there already to sustain a sufficient fleet. We need to do that efficiently. So that material extraction, make sure if we are extracting new material, you do it really efficiently, and that you use that material efficiently in the car and in the processes that make the car. Also sharing, and say having only one person in most cars, and I think it's 1.5 is the typical number in cars around the world overall. You can use car sharing, you know, the Ubers and so forth. You know, you can make much better utilization of the asset by sharing the cars and having more people in them. And you can go driverless. Now, the driverless bit's important because that 5% utilization is down to the fact that, you know, you drive your car to work and then you leave it there. No one else can use it. If it could be shared and was driverless, your utilization of the asset goes from 5% to more like a taxi, which is about 50%. So you have 10% better productivity from the capital asset by moving to a sharing and driverless mode. And finally, when you step back, and this was in Ben's presentation earlier as well, you said, what is the value we bring? What are we about as a business? And if you'd asked JLR that, you know, sort of a few years ago, it would have, well, we sell cars, you know, we sell luxury cars to rich people. That's kind of what we do. But it's more nuanced than that. You know, it's about mobility. It's partly about status. You know, but there's a whole range of things that are actually the value that's being delivered. The actual hardware is a bit of a hang-up and drives lots of system inefficiency. So if we can separate that and think about how value is delivered, we might liberate some options here, which could help us resolve those 2 divergent curves that I had at the beginning of my presentation. So another task in the 4 tasks Ben spoke about is to engage, to collaborate and advocate. So when we sat down and said, okay, this what we're talking about here to create a truly sustainable business isn't just making capital assets, making cars that we sell to people for them to largely park and occasionally drive. We're talking about a completely different kind of business, a different business model. And a lot of the pushback from our business, well, we don't really know how to do that. We're not in that business and so forth. And the realization came slowly that we actually do need to be in that business and we don't have the capability, which is where collaboration comes in. So for each of the elements of the strategy, we had to collaborate. So we had to go deep into the supply chain, and I personally set up a series of collaborations with our key suppliers, and especially the ones that were wired like us and were keen to move along this road with us. You know, who's out there that's prepared to collaborate and prepared to fundamentally change their business and maybe their business model to help us get the absolute maximum out of that particular part of the value chain. Also the circular economy. So how do we work with people outside of our immediate frame of reference, our immediate suppliers and customers? How do we go many layers deep to say, well, where did the material come from for this car? Where could it come from? Where does it go to? Who is the waste processor? What problems are they having with recycling this? And how can we design the car to make it more recyclable and therefore close that loop and make a circular material flow? And how do we make that the normal way the industry goes? So you have to go out there and you've got advocacy in here as well. So I spent a lot of time in Brussels when we were part of the European Union, working with the circular economy team there, creating regulation that actually would help the world, and certainly the EU part of the world, become more circular and actually enable that, writing regulation that didn't cost things to industry, but enabled it to efficiently move towards a circular model. So you're collaborating and advocating there. The next part, and we'll come back to this if there are specific questions, but you know, just having an electric car is not necessarily a great thing. If it's an electric car and you put it in Beijing today, it's a coal-fired car. That's not a great thing for climate. It's not a great thing for air quality. So we have to think about the electric car, where the electricity is coming from, because it needs to be low carbon or zero carbon if it can be. We need to think about how you get the electricity in there. So if it's solar power, then you need to store the electricity and then feed it in. You see a picture here of the Tesla system where you have a battery on the wall in your house which gathers the sunlight in the day and then feeds it into your car overnight. So you need to think about that, and you also need to think about the battery chemistry. The wrong battery chemistry can be dangerous and toxic, and is often mined from parts of the world which are rather volatile. So we need smart electrification, not just electrification and assuming that's going to be a good thing in its own right. So we moved to the driverless thing. Again, we didn't really know how to do driverless, but you have people like Google who are in the tech space. So we did collaboration with Google to create driverless fleets that would allow their technology to be married with our electric vehicles and get the most out of that particular intervention. And then finally, coming back to that purpose thing, we knew that as a bunch of West Midland kind of automotive makers and metal bashers, we weren't going to come up necessarily with the best business models to move the industry forward. So we set up a venture capital company called InMotion, which had a completely different risk equation to the rest of the business, that said, let's just go out there and find every idea we can that looks at mobility as a service, knowing that one of them will be the next Amazon, the next Uber, whatever it is, that will grow in a much faster way than our traditional business has. So we went out and looked for mobility as a service solutions as an active process to try and create the seed of a new business model for the business. So here we're engaging, we're collaborating, we're working outside of our business, outside of our comfort zone, if you like, to try and say, well, how do we bring all these things in and create this transformation rather than perpetuating this enormously inefficient model for mobility. So again, my team being modelers, people say, yeah, what's the business case? We're not going to make any money out of this, and how are people going to engage with it? How do you make it sexy, and so on? So we created a model. And we picked Cambridge as a random city to simulate this on, and we actually did the study in Cambridge with the university. And we said, if we deploy these driverless electric vehicles with all this circularity and so on, if we delivered that at least for half of the vehicles in the city, what are the implications for people, profit and planet? And the model we came up with said that each household saves about £3,000 by not being invested in this inefficient mobility system of a car. The company running the mobility for that city makes 150 million more than they would selling the inefficient hardware-based solution that we have today. The city loses 6 million in parking fees, but we'll park that and we'll come back to it. We actually lose 1,000 jobs, but we created 1,070. So it's more or less the same for jobs, which is interesting when people think that it's going to cost jobs. The amount of mobility there is goes up. So there are people too old, too young, too unqualified, and too drunk to drive. So more people get to actually move around in these driverless cars. There's 80% fewer accidents, 20% fewer traffic jams, and that frees up an hour of time per person per week to spend whatever you want to spend it on. In planetary terms, 80% fewer emissions, a third less resources, and we don't need all those car parks, which we can hand back to the city government, and they get more than their £6 million a year of value from parking back by using that land to do whatever they want with, and land's expensive in Cambridge. So what you have here isn't a trade-off, which is what you see in our industry a lot, or isn't just a win-win. It's a win-win-win-win-win-win. Each of these parameters is producing something positive because the old system is so inefficient. You can realign to create positivity across all of these factors here, including the environmental drivers and the science and the sustainable development goals. And I've not mentioned, but they've been ticked off here as we've addressed each of them with these issues here. So we went back to our management and said, look, we don't want to overwhelm you with 17 sustainable development goals and the 200 targets and so forth. So what we spoke to them about was 6 business actions that reconcile these two curves, starting with business efficiency, which is kind of what they were on already, but it doesn't get you to where you need to be in terms of sustainable development goals. But then we say we need an efficient supply chain with circularity built into it. So we're using the same material over and over. We need smart electrification, not just electric cars, but smart electrification end to end. And we need this autonomy, these driverless cars, and to shift our business model so it actually delivers mobility overall. So we proposed this between 2016 and 2018, and said, this is where we need to get to. And you could see that many of these things were there in their elements. But we didn't fully commit to this. This was kind of an experiment and a kind of sideshow whilst we carried on with the traditional business. So I left the business in mid-2018. And during that financial year, the business actually lost £4 billion and 4,000 jobs. This is pre-COVID, pre-Brexit and so forth. And that loss wasn't a trading loss in the sense of cars became unprofitable. It was a write-off of the factories that we built to create traditional 3-ton diesel Range Rovers. So that was a proper realization of a stranded asset. So okay, we're never going to sell all these cars that we plan to build. So that was a really severe lesson. And out of the other side of that, so what are we going to do instead? And we now see this strategy, the destination zero. So the highest purpose in our purpose triangle here, on our values triangle, is experiences, not cars, but experiences that people love for life. And there's a kind of a play on words of, this is for life, pro-life kind of, ecosystems and so forth, supporting life. And this big strategy that's right up there with the brand name is destination zero. So zero emissions, zero accidents, zero congestion, zero waste. So the things we were advocating being squeezed out of the system here. So complete transformation of where we're going. And you see there the Jaguar I-Pace, which when it was launched in 2019 won best electric car of the year, best looking car of the year in the world, and best car of the year in the world, showing that we had this capability to deliver something that was fit for purpose, but was rather latent because we were focused on perpetuating our old business model, even though it was becoming rather a dinosaur around us. So my point here is that the thinking, the tasks, the model and so forth all do work and are capable of creating that transformation. But the issues are it needs to be done rather quickly. I'm talking here about a decade that took a story that took a decade, and we don't have a decade, so it needs to be done very much more quickly. And when you get the numbers and the data and so forth, even it's a bit uncomfortable, you have to embrace it and do it, and not kind of just try it out. Trying it out is very expensive, as were the losses in 2018, 19 for JLR. There's the opportunity there to do something really positive with this and move forward boldly. And if your clients aren't, invested in this analytical stage, and if they're not finding it painful and uncomfortable, if it's not a difficult transformation, they probably have misunderstood the question, because it needs to happen quickly. And it is the future. It's not some kind of gamble that you're taking. This is the way you build a bridge to a successful future. So I'll conclude there and hand it back to Thomas.
Great, thank you, Ian. That was a great case study, and I think really highlighted some important points from Ben's session. So we've got some time now for questions. I'll take a couple of questions just from the chat function, but after that also feel free, as always, to come off mute and ask questions or pose additional questions into the chat function. So there's one from Sarah James about when you calculated the creating jobs in the Cambridge study, how did you do that and how were jobs created? And also, did you work with Drive Electric based in Marlow?
Did we work at Drive Electric? We worked with several electric drive and autonomous people. I don't know about Drive Electric. That doesn't ring a bell. The jobs created. So because we were talking about a fleet that was going to be deployed in the city, things like taxis and things like that were removed, and fuel stations and parking meters and those kinds of things. But the jobs that were created were around maintaining the fleet, because you've got a very heavy utilization. So somebody needs to charge, clean, service, book out and store and protect the fleet. Whilst there were conventional jobs that were destroyed, which is what everybody's concerned with about autonomy and so forth, in the model we ran for Cambridge, as many and slightly more jobs were created in maintaining that fleet within the city. So that was how we calculated that. There are different implications for the industry, but then that's about actually being competitive as a manufacturer. So there are more challenging issues for jobs within the industry itself. But that's about owning the space, that is going to be the autonomous electric vehicle. If you notice, Tesla are out there trying to completely own that space at some loss. And the first year we made that big loss, Tesla actually made a profit, which they're not entirely independent variables. But and not all your customers are Teslas. You've got incumbents who need to transform their businesses rather than invent a new one from the beginning. So the story here is about how incumbents do that. And incumbents do it by trying to own more of the space that's emerging and trying to mark out their territory rather than just following the startups and so forth. So that's how the jobs are created and protected in that situation.
Great, thank you. And there's another question here. What do you think are the kind of the biggest roadblocks for kind of UK-wide electrification?
We struggle to see ourselves as an auto-making country a lot of the time. It's not something we're as proud of as sort of French and Germans and Italians are. So we don't think of ourselves that way. We're quite cosmopolitan, sort of buy from abroad. So we don't really see it as something which is a strategic industry. and the dialogue between government and industry is rather weak in that sense. So it's much stronger when I see, say, certainly France and Germany, where there is a good dialogue. Now that's improved recently. I have to say there's been a lot more dialogue, but it's a bit late. So I think that understanding what the industry needs to do and getting on and committing to it and making sure the government supports that. And we have, crisis is a terrible thing usually, but usually some good stuff comes out of it. And what we have at the moment are compounding crises. COVID, we've got Brexit, we've got the whole electrification and carbon thing. There is the opportunity to create a really positive vision out of that, but it requires really good open dialogue between government and the industry, and then to sell that to the wider public. And that's beginning to happen, but you're talking about people who traditionally were adversaries, and it was about lobbying for no regulation, so we need some regulation. You've got to get rid of all that. So no, what's our vision for the future? This is a positive win-win vision. Everybody can get something out of this. So, okay, weapons down, demilitarize. Let's envisage that and think about it positively going forward. But it's very hard when your instincts are adversarial and trade-offs and what can we get out of this kind of thing. So the thinking is the biggest constraint to me. The actual physical capability is sat there right in front of us. It's there for the taking.
Great, good. And are there any other questions as well for Ben and Sue and some of the material that we've presented? Do some of the principles that we've introduced, do they make sense to you? Do they ring true? Do you think there's any kind of gaps? Do you think it's pie in the sky, unrealistic? What are your senses given what you've heard so far leading up to the program, and any kind of reflections on that? Does anybody want to come off and offer a view or a perspective? It doesn't have to be a question.
Hi, it's James here. I had a question, and it's relating to the difference between the developed and the less developed world. I think we heard on one of the other lectures, Thomas, that it was going to cost 50 to 70 trillion to transition to a lower carbon economy. And I mean, obviously, I'm looking at that. I think it's unrealistic for countries like Bangladesh, for example, to finance a lot of that transition, whereas a lot of production for Western companies happens there. I was wondering what your views were, and obviously, like electric cars is another great example. Do we believe that India, it's feasible for them to transition to electric cars in the next 5 to 10 years? I didn't know whether the three of you had views on how we counter that imbalance between financing the transition for economies which have greater GDP per capita to those that don't.
Who would like to take that question?
I might be, especially you mentioned the car things. I think it needs interpretation locally. So you say that India can't do that, but if we're imagining all Indians having an electric Jaguar, that's a big ask. Even though Jaguar is owned by Indians, but I've been out to India in the past year or so. And you see the cities actually mandating that the tuk-tuks have to be electric now, because they're so polluting. So that's how that gets interpreted in an Indian situation. There are lots of opportunities. Again, you wouldn't have imagined China was big on this, a decade or so ago, and yet they're in the batteries, electric scooters. They're really committed to do these things. So I think that it won't look the same everywhere, but so this needs reinterpreting to be relevant in different economies with different stages of development. A lot of economies, certainly India, Bangladesh, and so forth, they're not high carbon economies to start with. So if they're going to industrialize, if they're going to modernize, they have the opportunity to do it better. So yes, that will require some help, and that's about understanding the economics of it and where to allocate those the funds that we do have to make sure we make the most out of it. But I mean, some of those things are also opportunities, because if you try to push everybody through the kind of British Industrial Revolution, it doesn't end well. But you can have a different kind of industrial revolution, and you see that with things like telephones in Africa. You could say, well, how are we going to get copper wire all over Africa? Well, forget it. Just go to mobile, and they just skipped over that whole technology. So there's the opportunity to skip to a much better situation that is relevant to the situation and the level of development on the ground. And I'm not saying that's easy, but that's the kind of thinking we need to throw at the question.
Great, thanks, Ian. And Sue, with Unilever, you're responsible for 180 markets and have experience of working across different markets and meeting different expectations. What would be your response, to that question?
Yeah. Well, things always sound intimidating, don't they, when you round them up into a big old number. So I think when you break it down, which is in effect what Ian has also just done, and then you ask yourself, so how much of that change is going to happen as a function of consumers choosing to spend their money on something different from what they spend it on today? That will account for a very large amount. So to make that concrete, why would you spend money on a cleaning product that was more expensive and less effective just because it made an environmentally friendly claim, when you could shift to something that was cheaper and more effective and had an environmentally friendly claim. So that's a consumer making a choice, and that's part of where that money will come from. That is driven by companies doing what they do all the time, which is innovating to get competitive advantage and to meet future needs and have a point of difference. So the way they frame that point of difference is changing very quickly. And then you get to a point where you say, well, okay, what's the role of markets, the capital markets in all this? You look, I read just today actually on Edie, the news outlet, that BlackRock have built from a starting fund of 20 million to, I think it was 900 million already in the space of a couple of months. Their specialist circular economy fund, which is funding people that want to innovate, to start to develop and plug the gaps in bits of system change to create circular economies in key markets. And you see more and more of that kind of investment in what are called, generally speaking, green funds. And then, so that's the normal process of markets and the capitalist system driving money and driving innovation to drive customer or consumer choices for the better alternatives for the future. And then, so the remaining question is, what role is there for funds from government? You know, what would that mean for money that's generated by governments to try and pump prime, offer incentives alongside penalties and taxes? So we know, for example, that there was a point where if you generated more electricity than you needed in your own home through solar panels or whatever, you could actually sell that power back to the grid. And that was a policy, and then the government flip-flopped on that, and it's probably going to flip-flop on it again. But I just give it as a concrete illustration of the fact that government can look at the overall rate of change of markets, what they predict is going to happen as a result of market shifts anyway. It's the normal function of capitalism and innovation. And then they can look at where they want to spend money judiciously in order to accelerate change in key areas. And that little example I gave you is a classic example. So I would just not be intimidated by the size of that single number, just break it down and understand in real terms how that change is going to happen.
Great, thanks, Sue. And Ben, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, maybe just a couple of additional points. So next year, the COP26 in Glasgow, so the UN Conference on Climate Change, part of what they'll be looking at is enablers to, and part of that will be around source of public funding and contributions of governments. And one of the big areas is how the more developed economies help to fund the more emerging economies. That will be part of what will be hopefully thrashed out next year. But when Mark Carney was asked this question, he felt actually it was more down to sort of private capital, capital markets, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, and so on. It was really about unlocking that funding. Whereas at the moment, where the barriers are is that, first of all, we need to see an alignment between, if you like, what society is asking for, and we're starting to see that voice being called out clearly from society to decarbonise, for example, aligning with pension funds and then company strategies, and overcoming those sort of tragedy of the horizons, and having the right information, having banks manage the right risks and the climate risks, and then actually aligning those funds with that will then start to really unlock the private funding. So so I think that's really what's more likely to flow and fund that transition, I personally think, than governments who are really going to be cash strapped. They were before, they are even more after a pandemic, even though they'll be looking for sources of revenue. And one of the first places that they'll be looking for source of revenue is polluter pays, whether that's waste, carbon, and so on. So I think they'll be looking for that, which will only tip the balance slightly further. So I think the other sort of final reflection is that I think it's probably a mistake to think that we're going to smoothly glide into a sustainable future. I think that's pretty unlikely. The reality is we're going to face disruption one way or the other, because either we start to take climate change seriously and go through the huge transition that's needed, which will be hugely disruptive to, say, decarbonize by 50% in the next 10 years and so on, and stay on that path, or we're going to be disrupted by the impacts and growing impacts of climate change, biodiversity loss, and so on. And so that is likely to lead to surges and shocks and Minsky moments and so on, is I think far more likely to be the reality in the next sort of 5 or 10 years than this sort of smooth glide path created by, you know, international consensus on policy. I just think that's unlikely. So I think it's more about where those sort of surges in shocks and unlocking new business opportunities. I mean, we heard this morning Shell, you probably saw, announced they're laying off, you know, 10% of their workforce, and that's all around the, you know, because of their stranded assets in oil and gas and their transition into sort of renewable technologies. That, I think, is just the kind of beginning of those sorts of, you know, potentially quite clunky transitions, depending on the extent to which businesses are obviously on the front foot.
Great, thank you, Ben. Ian, I'm going to try and merge two questions here together for you from the chat function. Are you aware of any kind of significant steps being taken forward in kind of clean freight transport, bearing in mind that many of the clients that operate in the UK that are being funded by Lloyds have long supply chains? And also the example that you mentioned about, you know, electric tuk-tuks in India, if they're just fired by kind of coal, what's the challenge there and how do they go through kind of a managed transition, bearing in mind it's obviously a complex system, as you were referring to, between energy, the electrification of the vehicles and so forth?
Oh wow, have you got any easy questions in there that we could be doing? Yeah, very good questions. Yeah, the Indian situation is particularly difficult. They seem to be committing to further coal-fired power stations, which is just, you know, not the way we need to go. But you know, they've got some of the poorest people in the world. You know, they need to develop. You know, so I think that has to be a collaborative process that says, yeah, how do we help them not do that, because that would be more affordable to the world than some of the other things that we're doing, or trying to mop up the mess of doing that. So I think there needs to be an international dialogue, the kind that Ben was talking about, that says, how do you help the Indias of this world do some form of development that isn't so detrimental and doesn't go through, let's say, just repeating our industrial revolution, but for 1 billion people? You know, that just doesn't work. But that's not something that you can do as India, and it's not something you do as an industry. You know, it's something that needs to be a grand sort of centre stage kind of dialogue around that. So yeah, you can do the technological kind of increments that feel like they're going in the right direction, but they have to have a context that actually works. And the Indian situation is particularly precarious at the moment. So what was, sorry, the second question?
Just around kind of international freight and kind of clean freight.
Yeah,
there's lots of examples of doing zero carbon, like shipping and so forth, and like Maersk and stuff are doing stuff.
Maersk was the one that came to my mind. Yeah, so the freight has been exempted from this for a long time. So if you actually talk to freight companies, and I have through my discussions about our supply chain, perhaps sort of simplifying it too much, but couldn't give a damn is probably how you know, if you're trying to sort of put into a simple phrase about where they are, because they weren't subjected to regulation, because it's international. You can sort of slip through and put your ships over here and your fuel over there, and so there's no pressure on us, and hey, we're hardly making any money anyway, so you know, don't expect us to do anything extra. And by that means, you know, you end up with high carbon shipping and so forth. So I think there's a whole, as with the automotive, you know, trade, as I tried to break it down, when you look at it and you look at how much international trade there is and how much there needs to be, and how you might be able to locally source, and how you might be able to do smart shipping, and how you might be able to use wind power, you know, there's all sorts of things in there. So it needs the same systemic root and branch reinvention that says the whole industry was wind power to start with. Somebody started throwing the dirtiest fuel you can imagine at powering ships, and that was the answer. So you could at least have wind assisted, you know, computer control ships, retrofit these kinds of things, and also there's a lot of technology around that whole system to make it efficient as well. So how do you make sure there aren't empty ships and these kinds of things? So I think there's an enormous amount of opportunity for the industry, and they are just waking up. People like Maersk are saying, okay, we're going to put our flag on this, and I think that hopefully will catalyse a transition. But they are very, very entrenched in kind of incumbency, and it's a lot of excuses, a bit like automotive, you know, which kind of leaves the door open for somebody to come in and say, okay, I'll do this, you know, and you need a kind of Elon Musk in that situation. So, okay, forget it, here's a better way of doing it.
Great,
thank you. So are we out of time, or have I got time to make one very quick final point?
We are out of time, so I just want to, but you can make that point if people can hang on for a moment, but I just want to thank you all in case people do need to dial off. Feel free to dial off, and thanks all the speakers. But Sue, yeah, if you'd like to make another point, I'm happy to do that, and if people can hang on.
20 seconds.
Okay, perfect, go ahead.
So in the pandemic, what we learned was that global supply chains are actually very resilient. After all those silly people had panic bought tins of tomatoes and bog roll, guess what? It all bounced back, and that stuff had come from all around the world. Why am I saying that? Because the global businesses that run our global economies are increasingly just not going to do business with companies that don't help them deliver their targets. Unilever won't do business with Indian companies that are fossil fuel derived in a period of time. Every customer has to provide the carbon footprint of everything it supplies to Unilever. In 5 years' time, most big companies will be doing that. So the market levers will drive this change much more quickly than you might imagine. So I just wanted to end on good news.
Great, and I think that's a very valid point. The pressure that some of these big organisations can place aggressively on vast supply chain that go all over the world. So thanks again, Ian, Ben, and Sue for joining us. That was a really interesting conversation. Please, everybody, you've got time in your diary next week. Please do log on to the online campus and do Module 7, which is a self-paced learning. And we will see you the week after for our final wrap-up as part of Module 8. So thanks again for dialing in, and look forward to seeing you and speaking again in a couple of weeks. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks,
Good to see you.
Thomas. Thanks, Teresa.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Sue.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.